Kelly's here today to share the story of Barry Gibson, who in 1952 journeyed from Sifton, Manitoba to Minaki. Kelly will share his story, including how the famous Minaki sweater, or Minaki jacket as we called them, came to be. Recently, a Facebook post of a pattern for knitting the sweaters was widely shared, and I happened to recognize the model for the pattern. It was a high school version of my now 64-year-old sister Laura. Her modeling career was brief, but the sweaters were and are timeless and are still cherished by their owners. I've even seen our next storyteller wearing his. Let's welcome Kelly as we enjoy this story together.
Hi everyone, I'm Kelly Gibson, and thank you all for coming. My story today is about my dad, Barry Gibson, 3 companies, his passion for golf, music, and how the entire Gibson clan ended up in Minaki. I moved to Minaki 51 years ago and still feel daily joy living in such a beautiful place. Minaki's a wonderful, wonderful place. My parents had a cottage in Minaki, and next door was Murray's Camp. And they purchased Murray's Camp because they made the decision to move down and start a wool company. So the first thing that happened, we had to renovate all the buildings on the property, build a little warehouse, build their home. And they started the Minaki Trading Company, and hence a Minaki sweater. And the sweaters were in kit form, so you could order a sweater from them, and they would package the wool. Well, yeah, that's okay. Yeah. Do you have that picture of the Minaki Trading Company? There we go. That's the right picture. So that was one of the renovated offices, and that was the little company they had. And so you package the sweater in kit form with needles and instructions, and they shipped those sweaters all over Canada and North America for about 10 years. All the people he hired were local Minaki employees. As you can see, there's Marge Barr. Well, they were all people from Minaki that were hired to run the company with them. Now, one of the fun things about a mail order company, my mom, standing up with Dad, you would get letters every day, and people were, it was pre-internet, so everything was done by mail, letters. So you would go to the post office every day, get letters, and people would, send in pictures of their dogs with sweaters, their whole family with sweaters. I mean, it just went on. And my mom was great. She had beautiful handwriting and, loved it. She would open letters every day, and a whole bunch of nice people would be asking questions, and she'd write them back, and it was great. The other thing that was fun about that mail order business, you'd go to the mail every morning. We kept the Minaki post office just hopping. Thank goodness Mark Warren, the postmistress, was a knitter and loved the whole idea. You get to open letters every day with money in them. So it's kind of fun. So we had a family running joke was always how much came in today, what happened, and it varied wildly. So and then after 10 years or so, my dad decided to move into Kenora. Just the Murray's Camp was a bit much, all the maintenance. And he closed it down and moved into Kenora. So his Minaki experience was premised on my dad's experience 20 years before as a designer and general manager of a company called Mary Maxim. He was age 23, there we go. Mary Maxim sweaters became a huge success story in Canada in the early 50s. A huge success. Everybody had a Mary Maxim sweater. It was right across the country, all the curlers. And just get my bearings here. Oh, and the reason it was a success, this is why. My dad and Willard McFedrin, the owner of Mary Maxim was north of, he lived in Sifton, north of Dauphin. They were just both great guys and big thinkers. So here's the story. This is the story how Willard met my dad. Willard was coming into Winnipeg to try and find a general manager. His little wool company was expanding. He wasn't into sweaters yet. He was into spinning wheels and some other things, but he had an idea. So he walked into Winnipeg looking just for kind of some print shop to put a campaign together to get him a good manager for his business, a general manager. So he met my dad, who was a graphic artist. He was actually in charge of graphics at the Hudson's Bay when he was 22, and when he was 23 it has another shop. So Willard walks into the shop, and they start a conversation, and the following happens. My dad said, forget it, I'll be your manager. Actually went to his hotel room that night, and he said, I want the job, I'll be your manager. So Willard hired him on the spot, and my mom and dad, actually my dad, shortly after that, proposed to my mom, and they moved to Sifton, Manitoba, to take the job. And yeah, and you know, and the first order of business in Sifton, this was a huge deal at the time. Willard had an idea about all these patterns on sweaters, but you physically couldn't do it with the existing graphs. It just didn't work. So my dad's first order of business, being the graphic artist he was, he had to redesign how the whole sweater graph worked to get all these images onto the sweaters. And so that was his first that's the first thing he had to do to make all of this work. And he solved that one right away. And then on top of that, he designed 55 or 60 patterns right away. And so the company was launched, and it started rolling right away with huge sales. One of the other things they did, Willard and him together were just a great team, and I don't know how they pulled this off, but they would get celebrities sweaters, and my dad, I don't know who phoned Bob Hope, but my dad met Bob Hope at the Royal Alec Hotel in Winnipeg, and there was an entourage of people. They did the photo shoot, and he said they went up in the elevator he was with like 15 people crowded around Bob Hope. So they ended up in his hotel room, and everyone left, and my dad was sitting there with Bob Hope. He said he was a great guy. He was making jokes about his kidneys, and just a fun guy. And so they spent about a half an hour together alone in the room, and that was back in the early 50s. So the next thing that happened, it got so successful, there was about 2,000 pieces of mail a day coming into Mary Maxim. So they had moved to Dauphin by that time from Sifton, and the demand was just too great, so they had to move down to Eastern Ontario. And my dad didn't want to go. He wanted to go back to Winnipeg. And so they parted company. Him and Willard were great friends. And today that company is still operating. It became the biggest mail order company in North America of its kind. It's still operating today, third generation, and I think it's Ann Arbor, Michigan. And going through the archives for this story, I pulled out a letter, and it was a really nice letter from Willard's daughter. Just said none of it would have happened for their whole family if it wasn't for my dad. So the next venture, he went to Winnipeg. Yeah, his next venture was he started Gibson and Swenson Advertising. And somehow, I was probably only 6 or 7 when that started, but by age 10, that company was already a fairly big company. It had 30 or 40 employees. And my memory of that is I would go to that building, the Bell Block, and that is beautiful historic building. I have a vivid memory of this. And my dad would take me, maybe I was 10 or 11 on weekends, and they had 2 or 3 floors in the Bell Block, and I'd run around there. He would be doing work in his office upstairs, And I would run around with the custodian, Finn McGregor. I think he was wearing a Mary Maxim sweater too. I just remember an old guy with a Mary Maxim sweater. He'd take me into the basement. But the first floor was all printing presses. The next floor with this art department that was just easels everywhere. And then executive offices upstairs. And I remember running around. I always come home with art supplies. They're just a really, really fun place to visit. Now, I don't know how my dad pulled off growing that company so fast, but my theory is the following. He was extremely creative, just endless ideas, endless ideas. They had all kinds of big accounts with the advertising company, but his ability, you could tell him something, he would listen to you. And he'd get it right up the next morning. This is, again, of course, all pre-computers. And he would start drawing all the images and writing all the copy at such a high rate of speed. Like 2-3 days later, he would have a whole campaign going. And I think, well, he did that hundreds of times. And he could just switch on a dime and was passionate about all of it. He just loved the drawing part, the creating part, the writing copy part, and he was good at it. So in that time frame, given all that, he had some other ventures, which I dug out of the archives. Do you want to put up? Yeah, he in that time frame, and I forgot about all this, because he, put out this golf game, armchair golf, that was out in the market. So that was one of his ventures. The other one, which I forgot about, that really flabbergasted me, he started a family school of music in St. James in Winnipeg. And this was just a side venture. And it wasn't just music, it was dance. They had a pre-kindergarten. And in the first 6 weeks, they signed up 300 people, were students to that school. And that was happening through all this time, too. So my dad he loved music, he loved golf. So he took his first banjo lesson when I think he was about 38 years old. And, so he learned to play a few chords on the banjo. But of course, being the type of guy he was, he surrounded himself with some good musicians immediately. And they started doing corporate gigs around Winnipeg, and the banjo bandits were popping up everywhere, so I'm sure he was having the time of his life. And, yeah. So the other thing that comes to mind, he loved, just for the fun of it, this was like a hobby for him, putting on special events. So I remember this as a kid. Before we get to that, I remember there was, we lived in Westdale Place in Winnipeg, and he had the idea, we got to close the street down and have the first street party in Winnipeg. So he went to the St. Vital government at the time, whatever, and they said they would close the street. All the neighbors agreed. So we had a big street party, and I remember as a kid, I was about 10, I was in charge of pigeons because he insisted that we got to open the show with pigeons flying out of a box. So, I didn't have any pigeons, so I had to commandeer my good friend Dave Schneider. His grandpa had pigeons, so we ran over and got a bunch of pigeons, put them in a box, and Dave and I pulled it off. It was a great start to the show. The pigeons came flying out of the box. Away we went. The other ones, as you're seeing there, he got this crazy idea to a spoof on the Academy Awards called Citizens Award Night. And he rented the International Inn ballroom, invited hundreds of people, and all, orchestras, a year of planning, and it was just to have fun. But it truly was to honor just normal people. So he created a statue. There it is, an Ordinary Joe statue. Yeah, and he handed it about to people that deserved it. So that was a great night. The other one I remember, the very following year, 1967, it was Canada's centennial. And he, just bringing back memories. He could convince people to do anything. So he put on a show. This one was at the Fort Garry Ballroom upstairs. And again, planning, orchestra, etc. He would always write, all the copy and change songs and make jokes out of it. It was a big event. It was semi-professional. Anyhow, he would convince, these are all our neighbors. Like, he would convince them to do this. And they weren't dancers. He would just say, okay, let's put on a show, everyone on the street. Start practicing. And he had the ability, and they actually did it, which I can't even imagine that happening today. So that happened up in the Fort Garry. And these events had hundreds of people come to them. And the one in Fort Garry, I remember this as a little tidbit too. He hired a German engineering team with lab coats, and they laid out a Volkswagen in the ballroom, and their act was to put it together, like in 10 minutes, drive it around the ballroom. So that was just, he had to do I guess he just wanted to interject the scientific portion or something of the evening entertainment. So they did that. He said they drove around the ballroom, down the service elevator, and out in the street, and that was... So how we came to Minaki, he got hired. The Banjo Bandits got hired in Minaki, and my memories were great of that because we knew nothing about Minaki at that point. So we show up in Minaki, my dad's running around having the time of his life. I'm sure he had a few rum and cokes, playing the banjo, and I was just a kid hanging out at Minaki Lodge, running around, had the time of my life, got introduced to boats, got introduced to Minaki in this part of the world. Through that, we bought a cottage about 3 years later, and we all loved the cottage, of course. We bought a quaint little cottage that was right beside this place, but we had the cottage first before we bought that. And I remember I had a conversation with my dad at the town hall at a dance one fall, and he kind of came to me and said, so what are you going to do? It's fall, come back to Winnipeg. I said, no, I'm just going to stay in Minaki. And I remember he gave me a man-to-man speech. Well, Minaki's a nice place, but, cottage people don't really live in Minaki. And I proved them wrong, so I never left Minaki from that moment. That's kind of why they came back to live full-time, because I was living. And they came back with my two sisters, Pat and Jan, and we've all been there ever since. And it doesn't look like any of the youngsters are leaving, so we have a big clan of people in Minaki right now. And then he did move into Kenora and, kept up the same nonsense. He started a band in Kenora, the Friends of Dixieland, and I was part of that, and we just had a great time. I don't know if any of you know Bill Pendrick, but we just had I was with Bill, we had so much fun. We did that for about 6 or 7 years, and again, it was just huge amounts of fun. He also wrote the golf column, which, if you ever read it, it was pretty funny. And he also, Rob DiCucci he met from OD Design and the Bruco. They were good buddies. And every time, I get together with Rob, if we're having a beer, he talks very highly of my dad. They really got along well. And I think my dad was a bit of a mentor to Rob. And this is just a sample, probably, kind of his last bit of work when he's in Kenora. He did all this work, and you might recognize some of these logos and et cetera. They're still going, a lot of them. I see them all about town all the time. And that's it. And that's a short version of my dad's career. So I want to thank everyone, Common Ground, all of you people for listening. Appreciate it. Thanks.